In this video, we'll look at how to reduce the fuel consumption of an SUV. In fact, the two devices we're looking at come from one of you amigos, Peter. Peter emailed us saying that he has a Santa Fe from 2007. He added a rear spoiler and side protectors and discovered that he was getting a few extra miles per gallon, and he wanted to know why. So we're simulating this Santa Fe with and without the spoiler and side protectors to see how the aerodynamics are affected. Maybe the reason for the increased efficiency will be seen. And just as a side note, the side protector aerodynamics that we'll see are incredible, unlike anything I've ever seen. And it seems ridiculous because of how small and almost non-existent they are. And that just adds to the surprise. We'll see later that Peter really found something I think no one else actually knows about right now. Anyway, the Santa Fe is actually pretty aerodynamic for an SUV, especially considering that this version is almost 20 years old. For the simulation without the rear spoiler or side protectors, the drag coefficient came in at 0.40, which is about the same as a Cadillac Escalade or Toyota Land Cruiser from about now. So it will be interesting to see how the spoiler and side protectors affect the flow, if they do. To find out, let's first look at the stock version because this is the aerodynamics that these devices will have to improve. I should also mention that this version has roof racks, which a few of you amigos have asked us about. First of all, the front. It's actually pretty decent. So a lot of SUVs are very blocky from the front, for example, the Cadillac Escalade being an extreme version. While it looks cool, it's actually really bad for aerodynamics, and the Santa Fe shows why. So the Santa Fe has a much pointier nose, and if we look closely, that means that very little of the flow is actually being arrested. You can see that out of the entire front, maybe only a third or even a quarter of the face is experiencing blue flow, slow flow. The rest of the front is seeing faster flow. That's an important point because in this region, the speed of the flow is inversely related to the pressure. What that means is that the slower the flow is, the higher the static pressure will be. We can see that in this exact same cut plane, but now colored in the pressure, there is red here, which indicates high pressure. But only around the very front, around the bumper, do we see the extreme red region. In terms of drag, that means it is lower because there's less high pressure pushing the car back. If we were to contrast this region to something like an Escalade, with the very flat, blocky front, you can see that there's not only this much larger face exposed to high pressure, but the extremely high pressure, so that real red region, extends over a larger percentage of the face. As a result, this car has much more pressure pushing it back, and that increases the drag. The Santa Fe, on the other hand, lets a lot of the flow slip by with much less deceleration and hence lower pressure and less drag. Now, while it might seem tempting to say that this was all by design, I don't think it was. I think that this very good front was more a reason of the style at the time. For example, in the late 90s, the RAV4 was a trend-setting car, and it also featured a very sleek and pointy front. So it also benefited from this kind of styling. And after the RAV4, a lot of SUVs were styled in a very similarly sleek way. So this benefit was, I'm pretty sure, a happy coincidence. And the happy coincidence doesn't stop there because if you look underneath the front, generally it's pretty good. Looking at the velocity plot with these flow lines, at the front, the flow goes underneath and then there's a little bit of flow separation underneath. You can see these blue circles. That's not great, but the flow reattaches pretty soon after that and the rest of the underbody is pretty good. In fact, the lowest part is actually quite impressive because this is an SUV, but we still get the Venturi effect happening here. The flow speeds up quite a lot and we get good low pressure, which sucks the car down to the ground. This is literally the same effect we get on race cars. And the reason why it's kind of impressive on an SUV is because the higher off the ground the car is, the less this effect will occur. Here it still occurs quite strongly. Now while this effect is cool, for the Santa Fe, it's not really needed because this is not a race car and handling at high speeds isn't really a thing for it, but it's cool to see nonetheless. The top of the front could use a little work though. It's good in that the flow goes over it and stays attached, that's good, but the flow does accelerate a lot and quite a lot of drag is produced over it. One way to reduce that drag would be to round the front lip a little, try to spread out that flow changing direction over a large distance, and even curve the front down so that it meets the oncoming flow at a shallower angle. Right now, the oncoming flow has like a 60-degree turn to get around, and that actually makes the fact that it stays attached even more impressive. Just quickly, if you'd like us to simulate your very own car, let us know here. Now looking at the pressure in this region, you can see just how much low pressure there is. That's because of how much the flow has to accelerate and expand. This region actually has more of an impact on the car though. So we've seen in a bunch of other car simulations that the flow hits the windshield, decelerates, dumps a lot of its kinetic energy into it, and creates drag. We see that here too. We have very slow flow and high pressure, but that sharp front and the resulting high pressure there kind of reduces the region's badness. So by creating very low pressure here, an adverse pressure gradient forms along the hood. You can see that as we go from the front to the windshield, pressure increases. That's an adverse pressure gradient. That increase means that the flow coming in is being pushed back by this higher pressure. And we can see in the velocity plot how the speed drops and the boundary layer grows, that green layer here. What that means is the flow hitting the windshield is now slower. It has less kinetic energy, and so it can't dump as much of it into the glass. As a result, the pressure doesn't increase that much. It does increase, but it's not nearly as bad as a lot of cars. That's partly because of this slower flow coming in. So this sharp front, while it does produce more drag locally, reduces the drag downstream a little. Now, the other reason why the pressure on the windshield is relatively low is because the hood and windshield are much more in line with each other than a lot of other cars. Coming back to the Escalade as an example, now the hood and windshield still aren't in line, but they're much better. So over the roof, we have roof racks. I'm actually really impressed with them. So in the velocity plot, we definitely do get a wake from them, but it could be so much worse. So for example, the front rack creates a wake, but that wake flows directly into the rear rack. That alone reduces how much more drag these racks will produce because you're not wasting high energy flow on the rear one. You've already taken that loss with the front one, and now you're minimizing the rear one's negative effects. But the rack's goodness doesn't stop there. Another really interesting point is that the wakes aren't that big. The front wake, for example, is really only as wide as the rack itself. That's because the racks are pretty streamlined. And a final good point about the racks is that behind the rear one, the flow slopes down very nicely. That makes the rear wake much smaller than it could be, and in fact, looking at the rear window, the flow is attached over it a few inches still. That's very different to most cars where the flow will separate right at the rear's edge. And in fact, that actually makes me wonder if rear spoiler will reduce the drag here. Currently the flow is attached surprisingly well. If you add a rear spoiler, the flow will separate higher up and the wake might be larger, probably will. With that, the drag might increase too. We'll see later if that's the case or not. Another thing we'll see is how much the racks spoil the flow over the rear spoiler. Anyway, moving to the back, the wake is incredibly small for an SUV. Not only is it quite small, but it doesn't extend downstream that much. With that comes really low drag production in this region. This is one of the major reasons why the Santa Fe has such a low drag coefficient. One device that's helping shrink the wake is the diffuser. You can see how it does a nice job directing the flow up. That's even more surprising considering that we're getting some separation underneath before the flow reattaches and shoots up. So if the drag coefficient is 0.40 and the wake isn't producing much drag, where is the drag coming from then? The drag orbits show that it is really the front wheels. The wheels in general, not just the front wheels, sit pretty low in the wheel houses. So they're not only exposed to a lot of fast moving flow coming in, but also there's a lot of room in the wheel houses for the flow to enter, meander around and create drag. Increasing the rim size and tire thicknesses so that much of the wheelhouse volume is occupied will reduce the drag. Also, even just increasing the weight of the car will compress the suspension a little and lower it, and the drag from the wheelhouses will drop. Now in this plane, the flow is really good. The sleeker styling of the late 90s and early 2000s really made this car naturally low drag. Let's now see how the rear spoiler and side protectors affect the flow over the car. This car is with the rear spoiler, which isn't huge, but it definitely is prominent. The idea of the rear spoiler is that it gives the flow somewhere exact to separate from. Hopefully, that will reduce the time average wake and reduce the drag. At the very least, it reduces how much the forces on the car change with time, so the car will be a little steadier. We also have these side protectors. Anyway, the front is pretty much the same. I can't see any differences here. We still get very good flow here, a fairly small face, and it's exposed to not very high pressure. The flow underneath still separates and then reattaches and accelerates. That drops the pressure. The top of the front still has the same general problem of being too sharp, and the associated drag with that. Even the windshield flow and the pressure seen there are the same from what I can see. So the good news is that in this plane, the spoiler and side protectors don't affect the front of the car. Their effects are more isolated to the rear half of the car. Surprisingly, the wake is still very small. So remember back to the cut plane without the rear spoiler, the air impressively flowed down the rear window several inches before separating. That helped reduce the wake size and the drag. Here, with the rear spoiler, the flow now detaches higher up, but still, the wake is quite small and it's actually a little different. So without the rear spoiler, the wake might look smaller, but it's far less steady. You can see how it flaps up and down a little. With the spoiler, there is no flapping at all. The wake is very steady. And this is exactly one of the main reasons why a rear spoiler is added to a car. By steadying that wake, you can reduce the drag over time. But there's more to it than that. So the spoiler has local effects at the top, where it controls where the flow separates from, and that helps make the wake steadier. But if we cast our eyes to the diffuser, we see a small change here too. Without the spoiler, when the flow goes over the diffuser, sometimes it's good, other times it's bad. In fact, the flow over it is unsteady too. That makes sense because if you have the flow downstream unsteady, then the pressure and hence the forces on the flow on the diffuser will be unsteady too. So the flow there will be unsteady as well. When you put the spoiler on, the flow over the diffuser is still unsteady, but it seems a little better. The flow does still periodically detach, but the wake that's created isn't as large. So the steadiness of the wake is helping keep the flow over the diffuser steadier too. That then actually feeds back into the wake, because if the diffuser is working better, then the wake will be small as well, and that will reduce the drag there too. So this seemingly minor spoiler is having several important effects and affecting the flow even a meter or two away. As for the effects of the roof racks on the spoiler, I think it's pretty decent. Sure, the flow is slower and that is thickening the wake, but the flow isn't chaotic, so the spoiler can function perfectly fine still. It's just that it has less energy to work with. Removing the roof racks would help it shoot the flow into the wake more, and that would likely reduce the wake size and maybe the drag a little, but the racks here are much better than they seem. Looking at the pressure in this plane, the pressure in the wake is definitely more stable, with far fewer pockets of low and high pressure. Instead, it's mostly just a consistent low pressure across the rear face. That literally means that the resulting forces from the pressure will be steadier too. So the rear spoiler is working exactly how it should be in this plane. By the way, these simulations were done with OpenFOAM. If you want to learn OpenFOAM, then check out our courses here. Now jumping to 70 centimeters across, so this plane is now near the left side of the car. The rear spoiler seems to be making the wake worse here. Without the spoiler, the wake kind of starts around the rear lights and extends down a little. With the spoiler, the wake is starting around 2/3 up the rear window now, and the wake from there is even larger. So here, the wake seems much worse with the spoiler. It's hard to tell why the spoiler is having such a negative effect in this plane, so let's look at the streamlines. We can see that actually, the flow from around the side mirrors is flowing up and then separates around the rear edge. I think that makes sense because without the spoiler, we now know that the flow stays attached down the rear window quite a bit, but it doesn't with the rear spoiler. So because we have now more wake higher up, the flow can be pulled up more and occupy this kind of vacuum area now. So what I think is happening is because the flow isn't being directed down as much, the weight can extend up higher. And that is what we are seeing here. Let's now move to a cup plane horizontally, 60 centimeters off the ground, because we see something really surprising, at least it's really surprising to me. So this cup plane is pretty much in line with the side protectors that Peter put on his car. And it's a combination of the side protectors and the spoiler that gave him the MPG increase. In this plane, the effects of the side protectors are very obvious and incredible, something I've never seen before. So without the side protectors, you can see that the flow down the side of the car is really good. There's no real wake, but then once we hit the rear wheel, we get a wake, and the flow separates from there. That means that the rear wake now starts from the rear wheels because the flow doesn't reattach from there. With the side protectors, we now actually get a small wake near the front, just after the wheels. That's not great. That wake flows downstream and kind of dies out, but the rear wheels now don't have a huge wake. What's more incredible is that the flow stays attached around the rear face and separates way later. So the wake here is much smaller with the side protectors. If we move up to 70 centimeters off the ground, we see the exact same thing, where without the side protectors, the flow is all too happy to separate behind the rear wheels and create a much larger wake. But with the side protectors, the flow is really trying to stay attached and the wake drops. I've never seen that before. These planes show clearly that the side protectors are reducing the wake size, and to be perfectly honest, I don't think anyone knows that side protectors do this. The reason is because if you go to any automotive aero department, they're focusing on typical things like rear spoilers, front wheel spoilers, various guide vanes like air curtains. I've never heard anyone talk about the aerodynamic effects of side protectors. In fact, by the time I started, they had mostly gone the way of the dodo bird. The only new cars you'll find with them are utility ones, and even some of them don't have them still. And that makes me think that the potential aerodynamic benefits of side protectors are unknown because aerodynamics for cars really only became a thing around 2010. Before that, there were pockets of aerodynamic innovation, but mostly it was very minor. So if aerodynamics really only became a thing since 2010, and side protectors started being phased out before then, that might explain why their potential aerodynamic benefits are never talked about, they're not known. I even did a Google search to see if there were any niche papers on it, and only 2 non-related papers came up. Then loosening the search gave more results, but none were relevant either, so I think side protector aerodynamics are unknown. When Peter told me about his MPG increase, I thought it was mostly going to be for the rear spoiler, but it's pretty clear that the side protectors are helping a lot too here. So that's a great discovery by Peter. Speaking of the rear spoiler, let's look higher up at its effects on the rear window. This is a horizontal plane 1.5 meters off the ground, so about the length of a carrot. At this point, we see how much of a difference the spoiler makes to the upper window flow. Without the spoiler, the wake is definitely smaller, and this is largely because of how far the flow can travel down the window before separating. With the spoiler, we now have a much larger wake here, but it's quite steady. So whether the rear spoiler reduces the drag or not will really come down to whether it can reduce the time averaged wake and drag or not. Speaking of such, while without the spoiler and side protectors, the Santa Fe produced a drag coefficient of 0.40, with the spoiler and side protectors, that dropped a little to 0.39. It was actually a little lower than that, but it rounded up to 0.39. And I think that this drag reduction was mostly from the side protectors. As for the lift, without the spoiler and side protectors, it came in at 5.0 kilos, while with the spoiler and side protectors, it was about the same. That is actually a little surprising because rear spoilers usually increase lift, but here, because the flow was staying attached so well down the rear window, and when it finally did separate, it flowed off downwards. Adding the rear spoiler didn't actually change the flow's angle too much. So the takeaway message here is that Peter, through real-life experiments, found just how good side protectors can be, which is an incredible finding. I don't know what Peter does as a job, I never asked, but maybe you should be an aerodynamicist. Maybe you're a natural. I think we should all write in the comments, way to go Peter. None of what we discussed so far is the most surprising thing about the Santa Fe. During our research, we found its safety ratings. If you're an occupant, an adult, or a child, you're quite safe in it. But if you're a pedestrian and getting hit by it, then that's a completely different story. Because its pedestrian safety rating is 0, the most unsafe for pedestrians it can possibly be. So Hyundai effectively built the perfect death machine. Which leaves me with one question. Was that a coincidence? Or is Hyundai secretly hiring psychopaths? If you're staying on YouTube, YouTube thinks you'll like this video, so check it out. Peace out, amigos.